Now let's place ourselves in the firmament. What do I mean by that? In the last 200 years, the growth of Christianity, particularly evangelical Christianity, but all the strains of Christianity over the last 200 years have just grown tremendously. In the early 20th century, the known evangelicals worldwide was perhaps 100 million, most of them in the West. Today, the number is 600 million to more than that in some estimates throughout the world. The point here is now, today, mission is from everywhere to everywhere. Over the last 200 years or so, there's been 4 eras of mission funding, evangelical mission funding. Otherwise, 4 different ways of understanding how the church funded this explosive growth around the world, how they supported missions, how they supported missionaries, how they went out on their own. How did mission actually get funded over the last 200 years? Well, the first was the same one that had happened for the previous 1,600 years, and that was presence. That is, we knew the missionary was out there. Paul was out preaching. Hudson Taylor was out preaching in China, but there was no communication. There was no connection on an active basis. People went out into the field with a primary theological education, some preaching experience, a bag of seeds so they could plant a garden, and hope that they could preach the gospel where it hadn't been preached before. When they went out, the sending group that sent them lost track right there. They went out to the busy commercial centers in the developing world where Christ had not been preached, where they had businessmen and other interests in those communities where they could settle, preach, and then begin to move out. And at that point, they started calling their missions the inland missions. So China Inland Mission, African Inland Mission. What that meant was they were leaving the commercial centers and going in. This was the 4th era of fundraising. The home folk knew that the missionaries were out there. They knew they were doing something like preaching the gospel. They didn't actually know what was happening or how it was happening, which ushered in really the second era. And that is as communications began to grow in the 19th century and the ability to travel and connect and educational institutions started flourishing throughout the United States and went from Bible colleges to Bible universities to seminaries. All of that began developing. A lot more energy went into mission in terms of how many people started getting deployed. When they fundraised, they basically described presence, otherwise where they were going to be, but they also described what they were going to do there. And you began to see specialization coming into mission. And each person raised their own support. That was what was called activity. And that is, you may have been in a church that had a map on its wall that showed little push pins with a piece of yarn from the push pin out to the side of the map where there was a postcard of a family that you were supporting in that field, whether it was Afghanistan or Kazakhstan or somewhere in the world. And it gave you the idea that you were a world Christian because your funds, your tithes, your giving was supporting this work somewhere else in the world, and you could see it on a map. That was presence. Activity was what was on the little card. It said, they're working as school teachers. They're working as doctors. They're working as preachers. They're pastoring churches. They're doing other kinds of social action. These Christians did not. The earliest missionaries did everything they could in social action, in preaching against practices that were anti-biblical, if I can put it that way. Now the story started coming back, and the interest in what people were doing, I mean, it was like reading travelogues, reading these You can read their reports, go to the libraries and read their reports, and it was like watching a national or reading a National Geographic article or something. There was deep interest in it. That method of funding, the activity, came forward and is still the main engine of God's fundraising. Personal support raising is basically based on activity and participation in what you're going to be doing, so people know what you're doing. Then in around the 90s, when the American Christian philanthropy community started really getting active, making grants, the kind of jobs that I started having in the 80s and 90s, and I was part of this challenge of the third era, and that was this era of outcomes. Not only was it important where you were, remember, very hard to raise money if you were a missionary at home. If you were working for a mission organization here, everybody wanted you to be over there. That's presence. Activity is what were you doing? And so people understood education and hospitals and social action and other things like that. That was activity. And they funded as if they were funding a portion of an individual's salary. And then along came us asking questions about outcomes. What is it? Not only what are you doing, but what are you accomplishing? This ushered in some necessary corrections to missions communications so that you could be a little more authentic about what was actually happening or not happening with your activity. Was there a spiritual outcome that could be discerned or measured? Various things like that. After a while, it led to a belief that if you didn't have powerful outcomes, measurable outcomes, and better numbers than anybody else, you weren't going to get the money. And that set off a competition for making reports. And there are still conferences going on today for how to explain your outcomes, understand your outcomes, and how to get them across to whoever's going to give you money, because that's what they're giving you the money for. That's why we look at the three questions. But this outcomes question became pernicious. And so a council was held by Lausanne, and out of that we created something called the Lausanne Standards, which you can find here, or in the supporting materials of this. Yes, somehow they'll put this up here. Those standards helped us understand the need for the communion of giving and receiving in this age of mission from everywhere to everywhere, because we now are in the fourth era. And what you need to understand is your place in the fourth era. And what it is that mission, the center of gravity of Christianity, is no longer here in the United States. It's in the world. It is the majority world that is carrying forward the work of the gospel everywhere. They're sending out their own missionaries. They're building their own churches. They fund their own churches. And it's how do you come alongside of that if you're an American in this era of them being in control? So when we talk about autocratic leaders, what we're talking about is this emergent group of missional entrepreneurs who are now in post-colonial leadership positions in missions throughout their countries, and how they can raise money in their own settings and take responsibility for their work. That's what knowing where mission is from everywhere to everywhere. What does it mean to be a world Christian in light of what we're talking about here? What does it mean to participate in mission from everywhere? What we're saying is that there's no sending set of countries and no receiving set of countries, that every country should be sending and receiving, that the gospel needs to be carried by all of us to wherever we are, whatever holy ground God has put us on to preach. Where did I first start learning this? After stepping away from the rescue mission and taking a job with a philanthropy, one of the first ever, I became aware of a little newspaper coming out of India called the Friends Missionary Prayer Band Newsletter. I was fascinated by it. It was a very simple document, printed in India and mailed out occasionally, and so you didn't have a periodic way of getting it. But every time I got it, I read it with fascination because it was about this group of people who for 20 years had formed small prayer groups in the south of India, all of them coming out of vacation Bible schools and some of the great work of Youth for Christ and Young Life. They all had gotten a mission fervor, and they said, we have to reach the north of our country. And then what they did was they formed prayer groups, prayer bands, they called them. And for a couple of decades, these bands met and prayed about going north in India to what was called the graveyard of missions and sending their own missionaries, not encouraging Western missionaries, but sending their own missionaries. They decided from the beginning to follow the model of self-funding and not to take money, so they actually created a rule that they would not take money from outside donors, that they wanted the prayer bands to support the missionaries that were going to the north of the country. And so that's what they did. After 10, 20 years of praying, they finally began launching these missionaries, self-funded. And I'm reading this, and I'm thinking, how do I get in on this? This is so exciting to me that we're not funding Western missionaries to go there. We're funding Indians to go to Indians. They're going cross-culturally. It's as different going from South India to North India as it is going from Spain to Sweden. And you may think, oh, they're all Europeans, but they're very different, as you know, if you've ever traveled in that region. That's very true in India as well. 29 official languages in the country. They were up there working. I kept trying to contact them, not knowing their rule, thinking this was someplace that somebody I wanted to get to know. The leader of the mission was a guy named Patrick Joshua. We found ourselves at a conference together in Mexico for the COMIBOM, which was the Association of National Mission Movements in Latin America. They were all coming together and having a conference, and they had invited Patrick of Friends Missionary Prayer Band to come and make a Macedonian call for Latin American missionaries to also come to India, mission from everywhere to everywhere. So I actually sat in an audience where an Indian was preaching to Latin Americans about going to India to evangelize, and Indians coming to Latin America to evangelize. And I was just enthralled. I thought, this is really the new wave. This is the fourth era in action. Here's Patrick Joshua, an Indian. Here's the Mexican. No Americans anywhere except a couple of guys like me just sitting there observing. Later, after the plenary session where Patrick spoke, he was sitting in this large hall all by himself, and I went up and found him there and sat next to him and said, you know, Patrick, I've been reading your mission newsletter. I work for an American foundation. I'd really like to come and explore the potential of a partnership with you. And he said, well, your timing's interesting. We just had a board meeting. We just decided that our missionaries need some project money because they've been up in the field for 20 years. They're having success planting churches, but everywhere they're working is severe poverty. So they're starting schools and hospitals and other things like that. And frankly, it's strained our fundraising to be able to do that. So we're going to allow grants now to come alongside of our normal support raising. That was the first time I saw sustained interdependence at work, because this mission was capable of running its own operations, but it now needed additional monies to build classrooms and staff clinics and to put the equipment in clinics, because they were bringing medical and educational services to places that had never had it in 5,000 years. And so I came to India a few weeks later to have a meeting with him. It was the first time that Patrick had met with an American Foundation person formally in his office. You could tell he didn't quite know how to host us. We didn't quite know how to do this meeting because it was one of the first international grants I ever worked on. And we spent a lot of time figuring each other out, actually working through the communion of giving and receiving. That is the fourth era at work. That was it at work then. I was able to make some grants. Friends Missionary Prayer Band, their missionaries have created thousands of preaching points and service points in the North. And now the North is sending its own missionaries to itself in the country. All of that started with prayer and the belief that they could do it themselves. You've seen the film, The Handful of Rice. It's from the same region. That group of churches is in Mizoram now. They're 95% Christian. That is, if you count people in churches on a Sunday morning, you can't, God looks at the heart. We just count people sitting in church. If you count people in church, 95% of the country is churched. They did it all, raising the money for it through a handful of rice, through the homemaker making a pot of rice for her family and a handful of rice in the bag to sell at the end of the week, to give to the church, to send out missionaries. And they're sending out 1,500 missionaries right now, funded by themselves in multiple millions of dollars through this simple act of putting a handful of rice in the bag. That's the fourth era at work. And that is mission from everywhere to everywhere. These missional entrepreneurs, these autochthonous leaders who have come up out of their churches and are looking around just like missionaries have done for 2,000 years. And they look at the proclivities, the pathologies in their communities, and they go, we need to do something about this. We need to get after what is the problem here. People don't know Christ. People are hungry. People are beleaguered or oppressed. We need to do something about that. All mission starts that way. In the developing world, the next question would be, if we're going to lead a mission like this, where's our money? That was the beginning of the question. Well, how did you answer the money in the 19th or early 20th century? You said, well, I got to look to the West. That's where the money is. Where's my American? Where's my European? Now, today, what God is saying is look to yourself. Look to partnership. Look to taking leadership of your own work. This is what we're going to concentrate on because this is where fundraising starts. Do you remember the orbit? Let me show you the inside of the orbit now. There's this center of gravity. And what it's comprised of, as you can see here, is the executive and the structure of their accountability. Let's just call it a board. I'll call the executive a she for now. So what's the dynamic? You all experience this in some way if you're in a mission or even in a church with a board. Is the board an operating board, and are you simply an employee to carry out their responsibilities? Or is the board a policy board? This is the best method for fundraising, by the way. Although all boards start out as operating boards generally. That is, you sort out all the tasks among the volunteers who care about what you're doing, and then after a while it gets too much because you're all volunteers and somebody's got to pay the bills, and you have to start thinking about organizing and institutionalizing or keeping it down. But let me take you to the orbit again, and let's look at this orb in the middle, which is the center of gravity. What is that actually comprised of? There's the executive and the board. In the executive is the vision. You're the executive. You're the one that sees everything every day. You're dealing with all the encounters of the mission, the loving actions that you do, the staffing issues, the funding issues, the logistical issues, the community issues if you're dealing in a difficult country or a very difficult environment for Christianity. You're dealing with all of that. And God is showing you what to do about it. And you present that vision to to the board. That's the arrow that goes up to the board. In return, the board takes that vision and tests it with you, and then returns the vision to you as policy. That's the arrow that comes down. That arrow is a spinning arrow. That is, you're setting vision, they're setting policy, you're checking how things are going, and there's this momentum that's created. The executive releases power to the board. The board holds that power in the sense that they can fire the executive. If you can't be fired, you're not in an accountability structure that I understand. If you tell me you're accountable only to God, I'm really going to be concerned about you, because that is a very great sentiment. God will speak to you about your responsibilities, but to know that he's speaking, you have to know his will for your life, and you have to have counsel. People around you that understand where you're going. That's the role of a board. They're your counsel and your covering. If you give them power, they have to give you in return covering for that power. That means they've got your back in every area possible. Policy, staffing, finance, fundraising, all of them participate with you. We'll go into that in the workshops in terms of how boards work and how you go through the chaos of structuring properly for the growth that God wants you to have. So when you see this orb and you understand this dynamic of power covering, vision policy, and you understand the spinning of it, then that creates a gravitational pull that goes out into your entire orbit, out into the discovery area. And that's what creates the attractiveness, is this tightness between you and your authority structure. Because from that, if there's any division between you, there'll be a wobble. And if there's a wobble at the top, there's an earthquake at the bottom. We've all experienced that. So how do we get rid of the wobble at the top? And that's through communicating, communion, and having proper structures. Let me tell you about a friend of mine in West Africa, Renee Mabungo. Renee recently died of COVID, but he was quite a leader. He asked me to teach these materials a decade ago in Dakar, Senegal, and as I was going through this, I mentioned this phrase: "You're not in an accountability if you can't be fired," and started talking about the responsibility of the executive in this teaching. And then there was a break for lunch, and we were as I was walking from the teaching area out to the outdoor kitchen where we were going to eat, this one white woman that was married to one of the blacks. There were 55 people in the audience, all of them black except myself and this. And this woman that was married to one of the people, and she pulls me aside and in a conspiratorial whisper says, "The Africans aren't ready for this. They're like little children. They can't handle what you're saying. You need to back off because they're not going to get what you're saying." Now, I didn't say anything to her. After lunch, we came back. We had all the guys in the room. And I said, there's some people that say you guys are like children. You really can't manage. You can't do fundraising and accountability and good financial management. You might even be okay at program, but you're like little children. You need to grow up and learn how to take responsibility, and that this material is too much for you. What do you say to that? It took a day and a half for them to stop answering me. And it was clear that these guys understood accountability. They just didn't understand it in the way that I said it, but they understood it in their own settings. And we spent that day and a half trying to figure out what was the existing accountability in their lives, because all humans live with accountability to God through his institutions, to each other, to our mate, to our workers, and to our parishioners. Accountability is just part of it. So they wrestled with, what does accountability look like in our setting. And it had something to do with tribal council and the consensus of the leadership and the selection of the leader and how that leader would work. And that worked for them. And so they just needed to structure that into something that other donors, givers, could understand that they had an accountability structure. So there was a group in this, an African-led mission that was in this room that related to Renee for leadership. And you could just see the lights going off in their minds. Oh, we just need to show them how our accountability works. They went out and wrote a proposal to USAID because they had thousands of young Muslim converts that didn't have jobs because they had converted to Christianity. They had been excluded from the financial and social health of their community, and they were being pushed out. They were without prospects. They weren't getting married. They had a hard time finding jobs. And so this mission was put together to help them find jobs. They went out, wrote a letter, wrote a proposal to USAID showing them their accountability structure and achieved a $5 million grant. The only Americans involved were the ones giving the money. There wasn't a single American involved in that mission. That is the fourth era at work. This training is primarily for these fourth era leaders, you, the people that are seeking to establish fundraising and generosity, the corresponding discipling aspect of fundraising, which is generosity, the release of everything you have in your control of your life to God. That's the leadership that is now being taken over in mission and church around the world. Over the last generation, which I've been at work, I've watched the emergence of these autochthonous leaders. This training by Bakke Graduate University was designed for them as they emerge into their leadership. My own story is one of learning the hard way, of struggling to meet Patrick Joshua and understand him and understand all of those that were not out of my own experience in how they were going to take leadership and how we could come alongside of that and not be the leader, but be the supporter, the partner that we're supposed to be. That's sustained interdependence, and that's the work that you're doing. Some people say that this is an unsupported fact, but I think from 1983 to 2011, when I was executive director of two different philanthropies funding mission, that no one in the world read more grant proposals than me during that period of time. It's a completely unsubstantiated fact, but I read a lot of proposals. And if you don't get pattern recognition after reading that many proposals, then there's something wrong with you. And the pattern recognition that I've seen is this change to world Christianity, this idea that mission goes from everywhere to everywhere, that you can be funded in your own setting. It's very hard to realize that when you look around and there's no money in your community. It looks very poor. But poverty is not an excuse for a lack of generosity. And what you're encouraging is the discipling of generosity in people's lives, even if it's 2 pennies. Think about the most celebrated donor in all of history. It was a woman, an elderly woman with 2 pennies, putting money into the treasury of the most fabulous temple of that era. Did the temple need the money? We have Jesus teaching us a lifelong example of stewardship and sacrifice in this story of looking at that woman. What we don't see is Jesus running up to the woman and saying, no, darling, you don't have to give that money. Look at this temple. It doesn't need your money. He didn't do that because it was about the act of giving, not the act of receiving. he had another whole message for the temple about the act of receiving. And if you remember, he used a whip to explain it to him. This woman, though, is the example. These are who you're working with, and you need to love that small gift as much and more even than your largest gifts, because of the sacrifice. That is the living blocks of your work, is building with these kinds of gifts and doing this kind of work. And that is this era of leadership that you're in, and that we're trying to figure out how to come alongside you.